places that I went,
Wow.
as well as sort of an annotated bibliography of the things that I read and or listened to.
So we can.
So if you want it, you can take it, but if you don't want it, just pass it on. You don't need it for this morning.
We only need one.
So I'm going to go ahead and get going, just because I have probably way more than I'm going to be able to get through today, which makes me happy because we've got next week as well. So for those of you who weren't here last week, I'm going to give 4 minutes, maybe, as to what we did. First, I talked about my bike ride, the AIDS life cycle, the 540 miles from San Francisco to Los Angeles. If you want more information and you haven't seen it, go ahead and go to the YouTube link that I re-recorded from last, I recorded Wednesday night so that people who weren't here and we couldn't broadcast because of internet issues last week, it's there. So if you want the full scope of what we did last week, go there. But I started talking about the AIDS life cycle, and then we moved into the real question was, what does being a steward of the land mean and to you? And we quickly ran past the way that the US understands public lands, because basically in terms of public lands, it's the United States government that is the steward, okay? And so, you know, we talked about how that goes. I shifted to a bit on John Muir and Gifford Pinchot, who sort of worked at the same time on this question of public lands, and they came to different conclusions as to what would happen. Pinchot was very much sort of I don't want this to sound bad, a bureaucrat. He was thinking about really the question of managing public lands on behalf of the public. And Muir was more on the sense of how do we preserve these lands for the public? And so it's different attitudes. So they came up, they were both respectively the fathers of these two big things that we experience all the time, either the national forests or the national parks. Muir being the national park guy, Pinchot being the national forest guy. And so, you know, with Pinchot and the Forest Service, you can see that the Forest Service's mission is to sustain diversity and productivity of the forests and grasslands to meet the needs, So this is very much focused on what we need, how do we sustain that? That's how we're going to manage the forests. The forest also includes grasslands, but whereas Park Service is to preserve unimpaired. We're not going to fiddle around with this land. We're going to keep it as it was. Why? For the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. It's not for the utility. There are two different visions. Complementary, they were not necessarily rivals, but just two different visions. And I mentioned last week, and again in the coffee hour, the question of national control of public lands runs into this peculiar American thing called states' rights. And right now, in Utah, there is I don't want to call it a movement afoot, there is action being taken for Utah to take back all of the lands that are in Utah from the control of the federal government so that they can use them for mining, whatever they want. So there's this attempt to take these public lands. And so there are a lot of organizations that are saying, no, you can't do this. This came from the backcountry hunters and anglers who are all about preserving public lands, because it's the public lands that you can go hunt and fish on. You know, if all of a sudden it becomes privatized, then you've lost the hunting and fishing rights. So the backcountry hunters and anglers are all about protesting, and they've gotten chapters from all over the place. On the other hand, there are other states who are going in, governments that are going in and supporting Utah. So you've got this big battle going on about public lands in Utah, who controls. And what I find interesting, perplexing a little bit, is that, of course, there's the backcountry hunters. Lots of those hunters are, I would say, red voters. They would be NRA folk. So, and Utah's a red state. So what do these red voters do in a red state when they want to preserve their public lands? That's where some of this becomes really messy. And it works the other side too, but this is just a really easy thing to think about. So at the end, there were really two questions that I raised, end of last week, is, what is our role with regard to public lands? Is it to preserve or conserve? Preserve is national parks, conserve is national forests. And where does restoration fit in this? Because some of the national parks are very much into restoration. We'll get into that a little bit more today. So I ended up with this big question at the end of last week. What do we do as God's stewards of the land? Now, recognize that the US government is going to steward the land as they see it. So what's our role in that? How do we do it? And, and so moving into today and next week, I just want to make clear that I have no intention to answer the question. But I want to raise it for our consideration and our awareness that there are these two different ways of looking at the land. I don't have any intent to put conservation or preservation in conflict. Again, I want to raise the question. Certainly, I think that we've got a lot of lands that aren't really national park worthy. They're there, and we might as well make good use of them, but that doesn't mean exploit them. So, what are our attitudes going into them? And as much as I said last time that there's a difference in theology, I guess, about preserving these things for our use or future generations' use, there's a distinction between that and preserving them for their intrinsic worth. There's a distinction. I see them as overlapping because I don't think we're going to get the US government to say, well, we're going to preserve all this stuff for its intrinsic use. They're going to say, because that doesn't sell, right? It doesn't sell. What sells, you're going to get votes based on, well, this is going to be good for our use. And that's how these organizations were established. So I'm not going to put those in opposition. I think that they are intersecting circles, perhaps, just different ways of approaching what's going on. And then what really became apparent to me while I was gone, and this will show up again today, and as I was working even through last week, it's complicated. This question of preservation and conservation and stewardship of public lands is really complicated. Nuances abound, just like do red voters in a red state, how do they parse out their votes? Is it because I want to be able to use the public lands, or I've got to support the red candidate? How do you do that? So I'll just leave it there. Compromises are necessary, especially once human agency becomes part of the equation. What do we bring to it? Because as soon as we insert ourselves into any of this, we're going to have an effect, one way or the other. So that's kind of where I ended last week. And so I want to return, as we move into this week and what's coming ahead, to the question of praise, because that was what I was really interested in when I left, is how do we as stewards allow, encourage, help, hinder the rest of creation to engage in praise. And so I'm going to go back a slide because I didn't want to get that one quickly. Now we'll come here. We did go to Psalm 148. And so the red is really the thing that I was very, very interested in.
Gary, can you have the light turned on?
Yes, it is.
Yes, I
Oh,
know.
okay. You can't, can you? You still can't. Next time I'll make them yellow. That'll stand out a little bit. But anyway, the verses that are in red, well, it starts with praise the Lord, and this is this sort of imperative for praise. Who's supposed to do this? You sea monsters and all you ocean depths, fire, hail, snow and smoke, stormy wind, mountains, every single hill, fruit trees and every single cedar, animals, wild and tame, you creatures that creep along and you birds that fly, every single person. So this act of praise, everything is supposed to be engaged in it. Every part of creation is supposed to be engaged, at least according to this psalm. And it's reflected in other places as well. So what I was interested in is, what does it mean to praise? I don't know, what do you think? What's praising? We do it every Sunday, or at least we say we do, but what does it mean? And so I went to a Bible dictionary. This is a relatively recent one. Praise is an expression of worship which recognizes and acknowledges God as the ultimate source and giver of all good gifts. And worship is the ascribing of worth. Okay, so worship. So in short, praise is recognition that we, the creation, are subject to the Creator. In other words, we are not number one. Praise is an attitude of humility. That's how I would see it, is that it puts us kind of where we are. So, how do we as humans praise, right? You can think of individual prayer. You can think of corporate worship. Is it raising hands? Is it bowing a head? Is it singing? Is it silence? How do we praise? And if you think about all of those, it's not all one way. How do non-human animals praise? So, Google Images is great. You put in praise and animals and you get all sorts of great images that somebody decided to use. So I thought about that and I thought that would, but then how does something non-human, non-living praise? And I just thought, when you see just in its existence, have any of you ever seen the Vermilion Cliffs, northern Arizona? Oh, they're just spectacular. And then, of course, the Oregon coast. That's not, I forget the name of that geyser, but it's obviously not Old Faithful, because Old Faithful doesn't have the cone. I got there just as it erupted, which was really kind of cool. So moving forward, my theory is we bring who and what we are as parts of creation to the act of praising. Who and what we are. Our intellect, our skills, our physical abilities and attributes, our emotions. With all that we have, we give glory to that which or who is greater than we, which or who brought us into being. Okay, and I'm using which or who just so that I don't get caught in the issue of pronouns for the deity. Other earthly beings do the same, bringing what they have to honor or to glorify God. That's my theory, and I'm going to stick with it. There's a professor, I think he's emeritus now, up at CU Boulder by the name of Mark Bekoff, and Bekoff. And he's a really big wolf guy, does a lot of animal behavior stuff. And somebody asked him once, maybe I mentioned this to you, somebody asked him once, do you think dogs are smart? Dogs, I'm paraphrasing. He says, humans are human smart and dogs are dog smart. And that we've got to stop comparing them against one another. Yeah. So if humans praise in one way, the dogs praise in another way. They just don't do it the same way. I think he would answer, he's not a religious guy, but I think he would answer that in that way. So that's my theory as we move forward. So if we take our role as stewards seriously, or in our role as stewards, I see two questions. First, if we take Genesis seriously, and I'm sorry about the red, Genesis 1:26 says, "Let us make humanity in our image to resemble us so that they may take charge of the fish, the birds, livestock, all the earth, and all the crawling things." We resemble God. We are in God's image to take responsibility here that God sort of gives us to take responsibility for. And then at the end of Genesis, God saw everything God had made, and it was supremely good in this translation. Supremely good, very good. All right? So I wonder, might our very process of being stewards be an act of praise? Because that's what we bring to the table. Right? So second, that was the first question. If we take Genesis seriously, might our very process of stewardship be an act of praise? And second, more to the point of this morning, do we, as stewards, help or hinder the rest of creation to praise? Do we help or hinder? So that leads me into 7.5 weeks on the road. And somebody asked me, has this been a helpful process? In thinking through all of this, yeah, it's helped coalesce a lot of this. So what did I see? What did I learn? What did I witness creation doing all by itself? All by itself. So I'll refer to Genesis 1 and 11, 1:11 to 12. Let the earth grow plant life, plants yielding seeds, and fruit trees bearing fruit with seeds, each according to its kind. And that's what happened. The earth produced plant life, yielding seeds, and and God saw how good it was. A few verses later, God said, let the waters swarm with living things and let birds fly above the earth. And all of that happened, and God saw how good it was. And then a few verses later, God said, let the earth produce every kind of living thing, livestock, crawling things, and wildlife. And that's what happened. God made every kind of wildlife, every kind of livestock, every kind of creature that crawls on. God saw how good it was, and it was supremely good at the end. That was before the fall. I just throw that out there, which is a different story, but that was before the fall. So it was supremely good. In its origin, all according to Christian teaching, all of creation was supremely good. It was perfect, basically. Okay, so did we see that? Did I see that? And so I saw a creation with marvels of adaptation and resilience. So the upper right-hand photo, these 4 letters, BLCA, in National Park parlance, the parks are abbreviated by either the first 4 letters of if it's a one-word park like Yellowstone, it's abbreviated as YELL. If it's 2 words, it's the first 2 letters of the first word, the first 2 letters of the second word. So BLCA is Black Canyon of the Gunnison, and Zion is just Zion. Okay, so I didn't make that up. Rocky Mountain is Romo, so you can just go through and do all of these. So that's Black Canyon and the Gunnison. These plants, if you know anything about desert ecology, it's dry, right? And Black Canyon and the Gunnison is very dry. But these plants have adapted in ways to collect water. The little spines collect all of the water, or they filter it down. I mean, this adaptation to this climate, just sort of astonishing. And then, of course, in Zion, you can see where the water is. You just look where it's green. They figured out where to do that and where to grow, where it's green. This is not, I mean, it's not necessarily rocket science. It's amazing. There's water where the plants are. Ash Meadows, resilience and adaptation. Ash Meadows is next to Death Valley. And there's a big aquifer, if you didn't know this, a big aquifer that runs under Death Valley. If you go to the bad water, which is the lowest part, 286 feet below sea level, it's bad water for a reason. There's water there, And before that, this was a big lake or river that was running, and there were these fish. And as the waters lowered and got warmer and warmer and warmer, these fish, the pupfish that you see there in the greenish photo, they still live there. That water's 90 degrees. Fish do not live in 90-degree water for the most part, but they've adapted the resilience to that. And that, quote, ditch, if you want to call it that, on the right-hand side, that's Devil's Hole. That's where the famous Devil's Hole pupfish are. A different breed than the other ones that are in Ash Meadows. I'll come back to Devil's Hole. So they've figured this out. What about adaptation in different kinds of environment? On the right hand, we've got that's Muir Woods, north of San Francisco. This is called redwood sorrel. It's a ground plant, and its leaves, and it doesn't like the sun, or it doesn't like too much sun. And so when it's really sunny, the leaves fold up. And when they get shady, they open back up, which gives them different access to water and all of those other kinds of things. So they do this, and we were walking along, and I was looking at the same plant over here on one side of the path where they were all open, and on the other side they were all closed. The difference between where the sun was shining. So they've adapted to that. Lavo, Lassen volcanic, okay? This is lupin, and really crappy soil up there right now because it's still the result of all of the volcanic stuff. So it's really poor soil, but the lupin has nitrogen-fixing bacteria on its roots that can bring in nutrients. So that, and the leaves have little hairs on them that will reflect sunlight and also collect water, because this is relatively dry, except at this time of the year, relatively. So these adaptations, this resilience, I mean, this is doing all of this without our help. You know, we're not doing anything. So, you know, and of course, I'm going to go back to Lassen. Here is after the fire is 19 teens. You can still see the burned woods, but you can see the grasses are growing. There's resilience. And that's 100 years ago. But if you look at, if you look at Mount St. Helens, all of that lava blast and all of that, that was only in 1980. So 44 years ago, look at the trees that have grown up. Nature will not stop. We're not doing anything with this. We're not doing anything with that. It will go on. So it's praising in its own way to say, we will do what we were created to do. We will do what we were created to do. The interplay of pollinators. Just amazing, the variety. The upper photo is in Yosemite. We got to go out into a meadow with nets and catch pollinators, and then the ranger would put them under a microscope and we could all look at them. And they were butterflies, and they were wasps, and they were bees, and they were flies, all kinds of things, not just the ones that you would naturally think of. You see the butterfly there. I was in Monterey. There's a huge sanctuary, a monarch sanctuary in Pacific Grove, all about pollinators. There's no sound to this, but you should be able to see butterflies, and there are flies. Yeah. All of this kind of stuff in those bushes there. At Turnbull National Wildlife Refuge, which up near Spokane, Washington. Wetlands and estuaries, where our water meets the ocean in one way or another. Not all wetlands are that, but Elkhorn Slough wetlands. Wetlands are homes for all sorts of kinds of life, and they provide food for wildlife and for us. They filter pollutants. If you go down to Cherry Creek, there's a wetlands down there, the Cottonwood Wetlands in the state park. And it's in the 17 years that we've lived there, we've watched the cattails go crazy. And now they're going in and cutting out. The cattails help filter the water that goes into the reservoir. But then they're too much, and it begins, as they decompose, then that gets taken in. So they go out, they're going in once a year and cutting a lot of those cattails out. But the wetlands filter. They filter pollutants. And they store carbon. They remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and therefore prevent excessive warming and maintain a stable carbon cycle. They do this by themselves. We're not doing that. The photo on the right is Drake's Estero, an estuary at Point Reyes National Seashore, home for many types of life. They're the estuaries, or the nurseries of the sea, because a lot of creatures will come in from the ocean and breed or lay eggs in the estuaries, and then they'll go back out. They also act like sponges, and they absorb excess water from storms and floods, so they become buffers. They do this just because. I see that as an act of praise. What about biodiversity and interdependence? The variety of living species in a certain location. Healthy ecosystems are complex, have many different life forms. I love this quote, and this is on the upper slide. You just can't read it. From a tiny bumblebee to a bull elk, this particular wetland has both of those, a bluebird to a blue whale, a single poppy to a grove of ancient redwoods, and everything in between, all are adapted to and interconnected with one another. So all of those work together to do all of the stuff that they do individually. What happens if if something happens to one of the pieces of that interconnection? If you cut out one part of that web, what happens to the other web? And we could see this in all of these different places. So we've got slide from the Black Canyon that talks about interconnection, Elkhorn Slough. Boy, you don't have to spend much time at all in the Monterey Bay Aquarium to know what that biodiversity looks like in the ocean setting. Whether we've had anything to do with it or not, sometimes we do, like we put up piers and the pilings become places for barnacles, so they figured out how to use what we do and to increase that. But if we start messing with things like killing off all the sea otters, they don't kill the sea urchins. Sea urchins keep the kelp going, and so it just, all of these things, we start doing one thing, and we'll get into that. The Western Forestry Center, all of the interconnected web of life in forests and timberland, and how that changes once we get into it. And then this one this was a placard in Olympic National Park about these coho salmon that go up this one creek, Taft Creek, and they spawn, and then the fry emerge and live for a year before, and then they go back, and then they come back to spawn and die. 130 wildlife species benefit from the salmon and the remaining fish carcasses. So we lose the salmon, and 130 other species are messed up. This interconnection. So if we do something that interrupts that, if we consciously do something that interrupts the salmon being able to get there, are we enabling these other 130 species to engage in their active prey by our depriving? That's sort of the hindering aspect of it. So that takes me into what did I witness about human interactions? Any thoughts or questions before I go to this next chunk? It's a next major break in my outline. Okay. There may be, there'll be time at the end. Woo-hoo. Maybe. So what did I see? Human enterprise, logging and mining. In the upper left, that is, you can't see it very well just because it's not big enough. That's called Big Stump. It has its own turnoff, and it's one of the sites in Kings Canyon. And this thing is massive. You just can't imagine. There were pictures of it on one of the placards that showed a ladder going up to the top of this. Okay, so that was logged. I mean, Sequoia was being logged, which was one of the reasons that John Muir wanted to protect it. There was another stump, smaller than this one that I took a picture of. I thought this one was more, that the people on the East Coast didn't believe that there were trees that were this big. So they cut down trees, cut a slice, and took them to the East Coast, just to show the people on the East Coast that there could be trees that were this large, which just generated more logging interest. The thing on gold, of course, Death Valley was mined. Borax, gold, all sorts of things. Now it's big in lithium. They want to do a lot of lithium mining. Why? So that we can have cell phones. Yeah. All right? And there's a big controversy about how close they're going to get to Death Valley, because the closer they get, the more they interrupt the water table, which I'll come back to, which gets to a lot of other issues. So our cell phones are part of this controversy. And then, I grew up in Oregon. When I was there, timber, lumber, that was the industry there. It's not anymore. Tourism, more a major industry in Oregon. But it's no surprise that the Western Forestry Center is located in Portland, in the middle of all of this timber country. And the Forestry Center now is all about sustainability. It's they're really not about clear cutting. They want to figure out how do we maintain these forests and do so in a responsible way. Farming and ranching and other kinds of harvesting. The upper left is Channel Islands. That's what Chiz is, Channel Islands, which was, the Santa Cruz Island itself was a big ranch/farm owned by one family. And they brought in sheep and cattle and pigs. And the sheep and the cattle and the pigs, well, we'll get to this in a minute, wrought havoc on the island and denuded it, basically. So now as far as the national parks mission is to restore or preserve, and culturally, what do you preserve on this island? Well, part of the cultural history was the ranch, which is why they've saved all these implements, to say this was part of this history, all right? The lower photo is San Pablo Bay National Wildlife Refuge, which is at the top, the north end of the San Francisco Bay, borders onto the Sonoma Valley and the Napa Valley. For a while, this natural wildlife refuge was a farm. They were farming on these what had been wetlands. And what had happened over the course of time, they weren't replenishing everything. The land began to sink. All the peat that was underneath there began to compress. And the farms were then below sea level. And so they were worried about what was going to happen. So the farmer, fortunately, didn't sell it to developers. And it became part of the National Wildlife Refuge. And so now they're restoring all of that to what else be going on. But it was a problem. And then up in the upper right-hand corner is Zion once again. Mormons, this is not anything bad about Mormons, everybody was doing it. They went in and they saw water. This is a great place to farm. And then they began to divert water to other places. And so taking it out of the Virgin River, and that's the name of the river, taking it out of the river and moving it in other places, which depleted the water resources in other parts of the valley there. So the park is having to go back in and say, we do this. And some of this, not everything that we do is intentional, and not everything that we do is, some of this stuff like farming and all that. We need food, and we're going to go where we can get it. And in a place like Arizona or southern Utah, you need water to do any of that. And so you're going to take advantage of the water that's there. You may not do it very wisely, but you learn that sort of in retrospect a lot of times. And then, of course, tourism. Tourism goes back a long ways. I've just got sort of recent examples here, although in the lower right-hand corner is the Grand Lodge at Yellowstone, the Old Faithful Lodge at Yellowstone, which is, the oldest, largest wooden building in at least the US. It's just astonishing, but it's been there forever, right? And so you've got people coming in. How do you manage the tourists? Upper left-hand corner, you got to tell them where to walk. In Zion, you got to tell them where to walk. You're going to walk on the riverside, this is where you're going to walk. And this walk is particular because it will tell you that this is where you can take wheelchairs if you've got mobility issues. This is a good walk for you. If you go to Lassen Volcanic and you don't walk on the path that's there, you might sink through some of the crust in Bumpus Hell and find yourself in acidic, boiling water. And that was why it's named for Mr. Bumpus, who fell through the crust and ended up saying it was like being in hell. So this place is called Bumpus Hell. The curlicue up in the upper right is the shuttle system in Yosemite Valley. So busy that you just got to do shuttles everywhere. You park and you shuttle around because you can't find parking places at every place. So how do we manage, this influx of tourism? And then what happens with urban crawl? And I want to go back here now to Ash Meadows and Death Valley. They were going to build on the site that is now the National Wildlife Refuge, Ash Meadows. They were going to build this city, and it was going to be called, what's that saying? Calvada Valley. They were going to build this huge city in the desert. It was going to be the next Las Vegas, okay? And what happened, and so I love this quote from Edward Abbey, which you can't read, but so I'll read it to you. Maybe you can. There is no shortage of water in the desert, but exactly the right amount. A perfect ratio of water to rock, water to sand. There is no lack of water here unless you try to establish a city where no city should be. And I'll come back to this again, but what happens when we begin, in whatever we're doing, we begin to remove habitat, necessary habitat. And so I'll come back to that in a minute. But this failed for reasons that I'll explain in a minute. What are the other things that we do? Well, there are these things called invasive species. And some of these were intentional and some of them not. So in Ash Meadows, they brought in red swamp crayfish because it's a thing that you can put in still waters and they'll produce, and you can do things with crayfish. Problem is that they ate the pupfish. They brought in bullfrogs. They ate fish and small mammals. They brought in largemouth bass because there are some lakes there that you could go in and fish, right? For our use. They ate the pupfish. Russian knapweed took over land. Salt cedars absorbed water that took it away from native. Some of this was intentional. We bring things in, like we brought a lot of birds to the United States from Britain because we wanted our bird life to look like what Shakespeare wrote about. That's a reason that was used, okay? But in Death Valley, I love this thing down in the center, the blue one. It's not always intentional. If you drove someplace, you could have picked up a burr or a seed or something like that in the treads of your tires, drive in, and all of a sudden you deposit there, and that plant can be established. Just like what we see at all of our reservoirs with the zebra mussel. You've got to have the zebra. You're not intending to bring the zebra mussel in, it just hitched a ride. So it's not always intentional. Going back to Channel Islands, upper right-hand corner, they brought in sheep, cattle, and pigs. Denuded. This was all sort of grassland and trees and shrubs. They denuded all of that. The pigs became feral and started rooting around and began to dig up the Chumash native peoples had been there for centuries, started digging up their burial grounds and things like that. And so when the parks got this, they had to get rid of thousands of sheep, thousands of feral pigs. Most of them they rounded up and then trucked someplace else. They weren't all sort of executed. But here are these invasives. Now this was human introduced invasives because they wanted to turn this into a ranch. And so the priority was ranching. It wasn't what was there. But some of the invasives rooted out some of the endemics. So there's a scrub jay, the island scrub jay. This is the only island that this bird lives on. The island fox, this teeny little fox about the size of a cat. The pigs were starting to interfere with them. There used to be bald eagles there. What was going on was the bald eagles were fleeing that plus DDT. Golden eagles came in, started predating on some of the native species, cutting down the native species. So the Park Service had a huge task to go in and sort of restore a lot of this stuff. I told this story, and maybe some of you have heard me tell it. I was walking along, and I saw what I thought was a raven or a crow, except it had a blue patch on its wings. And I asked one of the rangers, what's this? We've tagged them. And it was, I raised the question because I wanted to go see a particular bird, the ashy storm petrel that nests there. I said, where can we see them? And she says, well, you're not going to be able to, they're in the part of the island that you can't get to. And the reason that the ravens are tagged is because they're predating on the ashy storm petrel eggs. Why? Because COVID took away the tourists who left the Cheetos that the ravens ate. And once that was gone, they started to predate on the storm petrel eggs. Talk about interconnected webs, So it just sort of fascinating all the way through. And then the bottom right-hand corner is just a standard photo that I took of a lot of flowers. This is in Mount Rainier. Had a whole ranger talk on how wildflowers survive in this alpine environment, but how we have brought in a lot of invasive wildflowers. We think they're pretty in our garden, so we brought them up and planted them, and they take over some of these. So we were told which ones to pull. Anytime we saw them, you're free to pull these flowers and kill them so that the regular ones can stay. So it's complex. So there's this whole question of invasives. Related to that is trash. So down on the left-hand side, I saw this sea garbage, ropes from nets, before I saw the sign about the Marine Debris Watch This was put up by Oregon State Parks. Otherwise, I would have had a bag and I would have put the trash in the bag. And Monterey Bay, the aquarium, I think I've shown this slide in some places. The figure in the middle is an albatross, and it's all constructed out of floating plastic stuff from the ocean. So plastic forks and other kinds of stuff, all constructed. So at the aquarium, they're all big on how do we stop plastics from getting into the waste stream, especially making it into the ocean. Because seabirds think that they look like food, marine mammals think that they look like food, fish think that they look like food, and the ultimate result is all of those die because of what we're doing. So keep trash out of the waste stream as much as you can. More trash. Upper left there is where old water bottles go to die, down from a trail. Just walking through Zion, saw that in a lot of places where things had either been dropped or tossed off to the side. Just awful. And then I was really fascinated, if you didn't get to go see the orca exhibit when it was at the Museum of Nature and Science, you really missed a really good one. But I took this picture of this particular plaque about this. In 2002, orca named Hope was found dead. They did a necropsy on it and found tissues containing DDT and PCBs. Do you remember when those were banned?
Yeah.
1970s. And they're still filtering up through the food chain and lodging in these apex predators, because that's where it's all going to get. It's going to go up and it's going to get more concentrated and more concentrated. So what we do makes a difference. And poor Hope couldn't praise in quite the same way that she might have done at another time. So the other things that we do is we create fires. I was in Lavo in Lassen Volcanic, where the Dixie Fire of 2021 burned. You can see all of the stuff down on the lower left hand. All of that area that's red and green, that shows the volume of that fire. The gray area is the area of Lassen that wasn't touched. So that's a huge amount of Lassen that was burned. And then this summer, the park fire, 2024, it almost reached, the park is kind of occluded by the Easy Fire photo. It almost reached the visitor center, this one in 2024. That fire was started, they found out, by a guy who physically pushed a burning car off of a road into a gully. That was clear arson, clear arson. The lava fire, the Dixie Fire, they say was caused by a tree falling on power lines. So it wasn't intentional, but it was human related. And then the Easy Fire, this one was the one that prevented me from going to North Cascades National Park, because it cut, you see where the white spot is in the middle of the red? That's where US Highway 20 goes through, and that's the only route that goes through. I couldn't go through there. Now, again, it was human cost. So we caused these fires. And creation does it too. The huge fire that hit Sequoia Kings Canyon is known as the KNP. It was 3 separate fires that joined and became one huge fire. These were all lightning caused. And that's what it looked like there in the center, up there. And they were still, these big sort of dead trash wood fires that they would start. They would say, don't report this fire. We're burning off this dead wood so that when they come through, they aren't as destructive. So we're figuring out what to do there. So there are some natural processes, and certainly at Sequoia Kings Canyon, because you're looking at the dead trees all the time, they're explaining this, that it is a natural process. And the sequoias they've adapted to, their bark is so thick it'll never get into the living tissue. So it can burn the bark, like you see down here on the lower left, and it's that tree that's in the center. But it won't kill the tree. But the heat from those fires caused the cones to open up. So it's a natural process. It's there. The Native Americans knew this. They knew this. They were watching this happen. But we're not so good at it. And so the question is, how do we manage fires? And all of you will remember, only you can prevent forest fires. This big thing, we were supposed to not have any fires at all. And what that turned into was all of this debris level in all of our parks, in all of our forests, that just sort of, when there is a fire, creates a huge conflagration that we can't do anything about. And so we kind of overmanage it. And so now we're going in, and the one on the right is setting back fires when something does happen to keep it from expanding. So we've learned a lot in the last 40 or 50 years, but again, it's a learning process. And then climate change is having, global warming is having its own effect. So at Sequoia, they point out, what do sequoias need? They need moisture and they need cool. That's why they thrive at these high elevations or up on the northwest coast of California. It's cool and it's wet. With rising temperatures, it's not so cool and it's not so wet. Will that climate change have an effect on whether or not the sequoias can survive? That's a real question. How many of you have ever seen a pika or a pika, maybe up in Rocky Mountain National Park or any other alpine park? They're these cute little guys. That's one down there. That's not my photo, unfortunately. I did see one, but I couldn't get my camera up quick enough. And it certainly didn't have the grass in its mouth. It goes around and it collects all this grass, and it sorts it so that it can get it all in its mouth. You see, they're all facing in the same direction.
Yeah.
And then they take them down to their burrow and they line their burrow so that when it's winter, they've got food. Okay, so they need enough time to be able to be out and to collect all of this grass so that they've got enough to be able to survive the winter. They need relatively cool temperatures. So as it gets warmer and warmer, they have to stay underground longer and longer so that they cannot go out and collect all this stuff so that they can stay underground in the winter. Does that make sense? So as it gets warmer on all of those rocks up at the top of Trail Ridge Road, they can't be out as often because it's too warm for them to be out to collect all of this grass. So that's a climate change issue. And then on the right is Olympic National Park. Increasing warmth shrinks glaciers. We've all heard about shrinkage of glaciers. That means, and it decreases snowfall. That means less water on the mountain, less meltwater into the Hoh River. And that affects the water temperatures, which changes the environment for fish and everything else that's in there. So this is all, again, interwoven. And I'm going to stop there on sort of because it's getting close. I want to make sure that there's time. Next week, I'm going to get to the positive side of what we've been doing, so to get you back. Because we haven't been solely the villains. Wittingly or unwittingly, there are things that we have been doing, and there's evidence of that in the parks and a lot of other places. But I'm just mindful of time, and I want to at least give a few minutes for questions or discussion or anything like that. Reflections. Mike?
What was really interesting to me about what you've just done here, any one of these single issues are things I think most of us are familiar with, or we've heard about. But what came across today that is different for me is how interrelated all of that is. And I think that's a terrific message.
Yeah, and that makes it so complex. Like I said at the beginning, it's complicated, it's nuanced, it's you poke here and something happens over here. So how do we make those decisions? It goes back to the voting in Utah. I mean, how do you make a decision about what to go forward with? We live in a society that is focused on acquisition and overconsumption, I would say, not just consumption, but overconsumption. In the amount of time that a lot of this, and next week I'll talk about when environmental laws began to change, because that's some of the positive stuff that we've done. But in those 50 years, What has happened to the size of a Happy Meal? Or any sort of combo meal that you get at any fast food place? They've gone like this. I mean, even if you go to Nana's Italian restaurant on Arapahoe and you just buy a regular dinner, I mean, it's more than you can eat for 2 meals. And that's one person's dinner, you know? So we become this culture of getting stuff. And so that's a cultural change. That's not just a change in activities for environmental issues. That's a cultural change. And how do we get past that? That's just really, really hard. Yeah, it is. That's what became, when I was trying to figure out, I didn't know how I was going to organize this, on Wednesday, and Thursday it got a little clearer and didn't become really clear until Friday, because it is so interwoven. Where do you start with all of this? Do you do it by park? Do you do it by biome? Do you do it, it just, really interrelated. Thank you. Pete.
Gary, your tours of all these different areas, thank you very much for the summary and all that good stuff. Is there concerted efforts together, or is it still state by state by state?
Oh, that's a really good question. Each park is administered park-wise, but it has a common mission. And so I'm just thinking about national parks. And so the National Park Mission will be borne out in different ways in each park. National forests have a common mission, but again, what's the best use of that forest? That may be administered by each particular natural forest. So we've got White River, and we've got several natural forests in Colorado, but they have different sort of environmental realities to them. So they're going to be administered separately. I would say overall, one would hope that they would have the same sort of underlying rationale.
And did you get any sense that they are communicating or trying to?
Yes, I'm going to give one example that was sort of the clearest. I talked with a woman, I'll get into this if I haven't, I'll get into it next week, who was science educator, and I met with her at Mount Rainier, at Olympic. But she was a science educator for a coalition of five parks in northwestern Washington. So Mount Rainier, North Cascades, Olympic, and a couple smaller units. And so there was clearly, they saw themselves as sort of a unit. But once you get from, let's say, Channel Islands, the interest for what Channel Islands has to do is very different than Redwoods National Park up on the north coast of California. Right. So they're not going to be so much. But Sequoia Kings Canyon, they adjoin one another. They're 2 separate national parks, but they're administered together. And they're only 100 miles from Yosemite, so they have a lot of the same issues that are going on. So I didn't get any sort of, other than, there we go, something just died. Okay, that's all right, we're done. Any other indication than that?
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
What I did find interesting, and I'll get to this again next week, is how some states are taking on some of this responsibility. Because, of course, there's state land, and that's what Utah wants, whether they'll manage it in the same way as Oregon manages state lands, or Washington, or any of the other states, sort of remains to be seen.
Right.
Any other questions? See you next week for the good news. No, this I didn't mean to end on a downer, but there is good news. And then there's some more challenging stuff, and I don't mean it in quite the same way as this sort of environmental problems, but questions of redefinition that really that was more than me visiting, but had to do with me reading. So, and listening and all that kind of stuff. So.
I don't think that was necessarily bad news. I think it's just a big awareness.
Yeah, yeah.
That's great that you were able to go to all those places and share that. And the praise analogy, I love that.
Yeah,
That was
no.
really good.
Well, we'll get more into that next time.
Okay.
Yeah, but thank you.
Thanks, Gary.
Yeah, I had to go through all of the parks, and all of the parks are here, and across the top are all of the different areas in each park, so I can say, okay, when I want to go back and look at this area, these are the parks I should go on. That was what took a lot of time.
A lot of research you've done too.
Well, it was mostly being there, and that was what was so cool.
Yeah. That's okay.
Hearing you talk about all this, it's disappointing. I studied all this 50 years ago.
Uh-huh.
We've known all this for a long time.
we have pain?
Hadn't done anything.
Yeah.
Well, we get upset with all our regulations to try and I mean, I run into that, I'm trying to build something and I can't build it because of birds nesting in the trees, so then we shut down the construction site for 6 months till the eggs hatch and the birds move on. And
Yeah, like I said, I'm gonna get to that next week, because the Devil's Bowl pupfish was one of the first, it was, I think, one of the first species that was protected under the endangered species.
Okay.
And now endangered species is being used, not because the species is necessarily endangered, but because habitat is endangered. And if the habitat goes away, then the species becomes endangered.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a one-step removed sort of argument that's going on. And interestingly enough, one of the major places where that's happening right now is in Utah, because of the Great Salt Lake. Because it's shrinking, and all of the migratory birds that depend on the Great Salt Lake are going to be put in